Nobody wants her, the auctioneer said, so nobody has to pay for her. The words hit the square like a dropped anvil, and Wade Calloway reined his horse in at the edge of the crowd, dust still riding the hem of his duster from 3 days on the trail. He had not meant to stop in Larkspur. He had meant to water his horse, buy salt pork, and be gone by dusk. But the crowd pulled at him the way a wound pulls at a man's attention even when he tells himself not to look. At the center of it stood a woman with her wrists bound in front of her, chin lifted at an angle that dared the whole town to say one more word. Her dress was borrowed and too big, cinched with rope at the waist. Someone had cut her hair short and jagged, the way men did to Apache women they meant to shame. Blood had dried along one cheekbone in a thin dark line, old enough to have stopped hurting and new enough that no one had bothered to clean it. She killed a man, a rancher near Wade muttered to no one in particular, spitting into the dirt. Or she didn't. Don't much matter now. Wade said nothing. He had learned, in the war and after it, that saying nothing was often the only honest thing a man could do. The marshal, a thin man named Purdy with a badge too shiny for how little work he seemed to do, stood on the platform beside her, reading from a paper that named her crime in words too official to mean anything. Harboring hostiles, resisting removal, striking a federal agent. The crowd murmured its approval of whatever the paper said. Nobody asked what the agent had done to earn the striking. $2, the auctioneer called out, and there was scattered, ugly laughter, because $2 was the price of a used saddle, and everyone understood the number was meant as insult, not commerce. $2 and she's somebody's problem instead of the town's. The woman did not flinch. That was the thing Wade noticed first, before her face, before the blood, before the rope burns crossing her wrists like a second bracelet laid over the first. She did not flinch, not once, and her eyes moved over the crowd the way a person's eyes move over a room they intend to remember. "Anybody?" the auctioneer said, already bored, already reaching for his gavel to close the shameful little sale with no sale at all, which would mean she went back to the jail, or worse, back to whatever wagon had brought her here and would carry her somewhere no one would ever ask after her again. Wade did not decide to speak. His mouth simply opened, and the words came out low and even, the way he'd learned to talk down spooked horses. $2, he said. The crowd turned. Purdy's eyebrows climbed toward his hat. The auctioneer blinked like a man who'd forgotten his own joke could be answered. "You serious, mister?" Wade dismounted, boots striking dust, and walked to the platform without hurrying, because hurrying was a thing men did when they were afraid, and he had decided, somewhere in the 3 seconds since he'd opened his mouth, that he was done being afraid of what a town thought of him. He set $2 silver on the auctioneer's table. They rang against the wood, small and final. "She's mine." Then, he said, and something in his voice made the crowd go quiet in a different way than before. Not amused quiet, but uncertain quiet, the kind that comes before people decide whether to be angry. The woman looked at him for the first time. Not gratitude, not relief. Something harder and more assessing, the look of someone deciding whether she had traded one kind of danger for another. "You'll regret this," she said, low enough that only he and Purdy could hear it. Her English was careful, deliberate, each word placed like a stone in a wall. "I am not a horse you have bought." "Didn't say you were," Wade answered. Purdy stepped between them, one hand resting near his revolver in a way that was more habit than threat. "Calloway, is it? You know what she did?" "I know what the paper says she did. That paper's federal business. Then the federal government can come collect its $2, Wade said, and cut the rope at her wrists with his belt knife before Purdy could decide whether that was a challenge worth answering. The woman rubbed her wrists, watching him with those same unreadable eyes. Up close, Wade could see she was younger than he'd first thought, and that the composure on her face was not calm but control, a held breath that had been held so long it had become a way of living. "Why," she said. Not a question exactly, more like she was testing whether he had an answer at all. Wade thought about lying. He thought about saying something noble, something that would sound right if she repeated it to whoever she answered to, wherever that was. Instead, he told her the truth, because lying had never once made a hard thing easier in his experience. Because somebody had to, and everybody else was busy laughing, he said. Name's Wade Calloway. Got a ranch 2 hours west. More work on it than I can manage alone. And a barn roof that leaks every time it rains. You want out of this town, I'm riding that direction. You want something else, I won't stop you. She studied him a long moment, the crowd still murmuring around them. Purdy still deciding whether this was a fight worth having in daylight in front of witnesses. I have a name, she said finally. It is Senna. Then it's good to meet you, Senna. She did not smile. But she walked to where his horse stood waiting, and that, Wade would understand much later, was its own kind of answer. Not trust, not yet, but the first small refusal to stay where the world had left her. Behind them, the auctioneer was already calling the next lot, some creative tools nobody wanted either, and the town was already forgetting what it had just watched happen in its square, the way towns forget most things that don't cost them anything. But Purdy did not forget. He stood on the platform long after the crowd thinned, watching Wade Calloway ride west with a woman the government had paperwork on, and he thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that trouble had a way of finding men who went looking for it with the best intentions. The ride to the ranch took 2 hours, and for the first one, neither of them spoke. Senna rode behind him on the horse's rump, her hands resting light on his belt rather than his waist, careful to keep a distance between them even where distance wasn't really possible. Wade felt the deliberateness of it and understood it wasn't unkindness. It was a woman making sure she still had a choice in something, however small. You're not from Larkspur, she said finally, when the town had shrunk to nothing behind the hills. Nobody's from Larkspur. It's a place people pass through on the way to somewhere they'd rather be. Then why do you live near it? Land was cheap. Man doesn't always choose where he ends up. Sometimes he just stops moving in a place that doesn't kill him. She was quiet after that, and Wade let the silence sit, because he'd learned that silence, offered honestly, was sometimes the most respectful thing a man could give. The ranch came into view at dusk. A low house, a barn with a roof patched more than whole, corral fencing that had seen better decades. It was not much. Wade had never pretended it was much. But it was his, paid for in labor rather than luck, and there was a kind of dignity in that he hoped might translate even to a woman who owed this place, and him, nothing. You'll sleep in the house, he said, swinging down from the saddle. I'll take the barn. There's a room off the kitchen with a door that locks from the inside. I'll show you where the key is. Senna slid down without his help, testing her footing in the dirt like she was testing the whole arrangement for weakness. You give the key to me, not keep it yourself. That's what I said. Men say many things at auctions they do not mean once the crowd is gone. Wade didn't argue with that, because he understood exactly why she'd say it, and arguing would only prove her more right. He walked her to the house, showed her the room, set the key in her palm himself instead of leaving it on the table, so there could be no mistaking whose hand it left from. That night, tending a gash on her forearm she hadn't mentioned until he saw her wince reaching for the water pitcher, Wade learned the outline of what had happened to her. Not all of it, not that first night, but enough. A raid on a rancheria that had already surrendered. A federal agent who'd mistaken her refusal to translate for her people as insolence worth striking her for. A brother, unaccounted for, last seen being marched toward a fort 3 days south. They will look for me, she said, holding still while he wrapped the wound. Her jaw tight the way a person's jaw goes tight when they've decided pain is something to endure rather than announce. Purdy will send word. Men like that always send word. Let them send it. You do not understand what you have done. Buying me. I bought $2 worth of nothing, far as any paper's concerned. Man can change his mind about property he never claimed to want. She looked at him sharply then, and for the first time something almost like humor moved behind her eyes. You are either very brave or very foolish, Wade Calloway. Most days I can't tell the difference myself. By the second week, the ranch had begun to shift around her presence the way a house shifts to accommodate a new season. Senna did not wait to be told what needed doing. She simply did it, and did it well, setting a hen's broken wing with a steadiness that told Wade she'd tended wounds before, human and animal both, reading weather in the color of the sky before Wade himself had noticed the clouds building. She did not speak of her people unless asked, and Wade did not ask often, understanding that some doors a person opens only when they're ready, and forcing them only teaches a person to build the door thicker. But the town noticed her presence anyway. That was the trouble with towns. They noticed everything that didn't fit their expectation of a place, and Larkspur's expectation did not include an Apache woman living, unchained, on Wade Calloway's ranch. The first sign of it came in the form of a boy, maybe 14, who rode out one afternoon under the excuse of delivering mail, and stayed long enough to stare at Senna with the particular cruelty children learn from adults who never correct them. Wade sent him home with the letters undelivered and a warning the boy's father would not appreciate hearing repeated. The second sign came 3 days later, in the form of Purdy himself, riding up the dirt path at a pace that suggested he'd rather not be seen doing it at all. "Got a wire from the fort," Purdy said, not dismounting, his eyes sliding toward the house where Senna stood in the doorway, watching. "Agent she's accused of striking wants her returned for questioning. Says it's a formality. Formalities don't usually require a woman in irons," Wade said. "Wasn't my choice of words, Calloway. I'm just the one riding out to say it. Then ride back and say I bought her fair, same as the law allowed at that auction you ran. If the agent's got a real charge, let him bring it here himself in daylight where I can hear it." Purdy's jaw worked like he wanted to argue and knew better. "You're making enemies you don't need. Wouldn't be the first time." When Purdy rode off, Senna came to stand beside him on the porch, closer than she'd stood before, close enough that Wade could feel the tension radiating off her like heat off a stove. "You should have let him take me," she said quietly. "It would be simpler." "Simple's overrated," Wade said. "Besides, you haven't finished teaching me how you set that hen's wing. Be ashamed to lose a good teacher over a formality." She did not smile, not quite, but something in her shoulders loosened a fraction, and for the first time since the auction block, Wade saw her look toward the horizon not like a woman watching for danger, but like a woman, however briefly, allowing herself to imagine staying somewhere. The moment did not last. Behind the hills, though neither of them could see it yet, 3 riders had already begun their approach from the direction of the fort, and the deadline Purdy had not quite spoken aloud was closer than either Wade or Senna understood. They came at dawn, when the light was still the color of a bruise and the world hadn't decided yet whether it belonged to night or day. Wade heard them before he saw them, the particular rhythm of shod hooves moving at a deliberate pace, not the panic gait of trouble arriving fast, but the slow, confident approach of men who believed they already held every card. He was at the barn door with his rifle before the dust cloud cleared the ridge, and Senna was beside him a breath later, having heard the same warning in the same silence he had. 3 riders, she said, already reading the shapes the way she read weather. "One wears the coat of an agent. The others are hired. You know the man in the coat?" Her hands did not shake, but her voice, when it came, had gone thin and careful. "Agent Coyle. He is the one I struck." The riders stopped at the fence line, close enough to be heard, far enough to keep their retreat clear if the morning went wrong for them. Coyle was younger than Wade expected, with the soft, unlined face of a man who'd never had to answer for the orders he gave. The 2 beside him carried themselves like men paid by the day rather than men who believed in anything. "Calloway," Coyle called out, pleasant as a man selling insurance. "I believe you're harboring federal property. Believe what you like. I bought a woman's freedom at a public auction, paper and all. You want to argue with that, argue with the marshal who ran it. The marshal doesn't set federal policy on hostels. She's not a hostile. She's a woman standing on my porch unarmed, who hasn't broken a single law of this territory since the day I met her. Coyle's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes did, the flicker of a man recalculating. She assaulted a federal officer. You struck her first, Wade said. It wasn't a question. Senna had told him 3 nights before, in a voice she'd kept level through sheer will, and Wade had believed her the way he believed weather. Not because anyone proved it to him, but because some truths carried their own proof in how they were told. Coyle's jaw tightened, the first honest reaction he'd shown. That's not the account that matters. Might not matter to your report. Matters plenty out here. The exchange might have gone on that way, words as a kind of circling, both sides testing for weakness. But one of the hired men shifted his horse forward, hand drifting toward the rifle in his saddle scabbard, and the morning changed shape all at once. Wade's shot went past the man's shoulder, close enough to snap the air beside his ear, and the horse reared, throwing its rider hard into the dirt. Senna was moving before the echo faded, not toward safety but toward the second hired man, closing the distance too fast for a clean shot, forcing him to choose between hitting her and hitting nothing. Get back, Wade shouted, but she was already inside the man's reach, driving her forearm up under his gun hand with a speed that spoke of training no auction paper had ever mentioned, and the rifle went spinning into the dust as the man swore and grabbed for her instead. He should not have grabbed for her. Senna turned his own momentum against him, and he went down hard enough to knock the fight out of him, groaning in the dirt while his horse danced nervously away. Coyle had not moved from the fence line, watching the whole exchange with the stillness of a man doing arithmetic. You understand what you've done, he said to Wade, ignoring his own fallen men. Assaulting federal agents in the commission of their duty. Your duty walked onto my land uninvited and pulled a rifle first, Wade said, leveling his own weapon at Coyle's chest, close enough now that missing wasn't a possibility either of them needed to discuss. You've got 2 men bleeding in my yard and a story that won't survive daylight if I decide to ride to the territorial governor myself and tell it different than you will. For a long moment nobody moved. The hired man Wade had shot at was cursing quietly, cradling a shoulder that had taken more damage from the fall than the near miss. The other lay still, catching his breath, deciding whether Senna was worth another try. Then Coyle's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough. This isn't finished, Calloway. Didn't figure it was. But it's finished for this morning. Right. They rode. Not fast, not with dignity, but they rode, leaving behind the particular silence that follows violence narrowly avoided. The ringing ears, the 2 loud birds starting up again in the brush, the smell of gunpowder hanging sour in air that had, minutes before, smelled only of dust and coffee. Senna stood in the yard, breathing hard, blood from a split knuckle running down her fingers where she'd struck the second man harder than she'd meant to. When she looked at Wade, there was something new in her expression. Not quite trust, but the first real crack in the wall she'd been keeping between herself and the possibility of being helped. You could have let him take me, she said again, the way she had before, but her voice had changed since the last time she'd said it. It was no longer an accusation. It was closer to a question she was afraid to ask directly. Told you already. Simple's overrated. He will come back. With more men. With real orders, not just a formality he can walk away from. Then we've got some time to figure what happens next, Wade said, lowering his rifle, feeling the adrenaline drain out of his hands in a shudder he tried not to show. But right now, you're bleeding, and I'd rather tend that than argue about a fight that's already over. She let him take her hand, turning it palm up to examine the split knuckle, and for just a moment, standing in a yard still ringing with the aftermath of violence, something passed between them that neither one named aloud. Not safety exactly, because safety was a lie neither of them believed in anymore, but something adjacent to it, something worth defending. Behind the ridge, Coyle rode toward the fort with a story he intended to reshape into something uglier than the truth, and the deadline that had been approaching all week arrived. Finally, in the shape of a decision Wade Calloway would have to make before it made itself. That evening, Wade cleaned the split knuckle by lamplight while Senna sat at the kitchen table, watching his hands with the same careful attention she brought to everything, as though the world only made sense to her when she'd studied its parts closely enough to trust them. "You fight like someone who was taught," Wade said, wrapping a strip of clean cloth around her hand. "Not like someone who learned it defending herself once and got lucky. My father taught me, and my brother before." She stopped, and Wade did not press, understanding the sentence had run into a wall she wasn't ready to climb yet. "Before the fort," he said gently, not a question, just an acknowledgement that he'd heard enough already to know the shape of what she wasn't saying. Senna nodded once. "He is there now, if he still lives." "I do not know. You want to find him. Wanting does not change what is possible." "Didn't ask if it was possible. Asked if you wanted it." She looked at him then, really looked, the way she had at the auction block when she was deciding what kind of danger he represented. Whatever she found in his face this time settled something in her, because when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its careful armor. "My mother gave me this before she died," Senna said, reaching into the collar of her dress and drawing out a small carved token on a leather cord. A turtle worn smooth by years of handling, the detail of its shell nearly rubbed away by thumbs that had touched it in moments of fear or grief or hope. She said the turtle carries its home with it always. No matter where the soldiers send us, no matter what land they say is not ours anymore, we carry home inside us. That is what she believed. What do you believe? I believed it less after they took my brother. It is difficult to carry home inside you when the ground keeps moving beneath your feet. She turned the token over once in her fingers. But I have not stopped carrying it. Even when I stopped believing. Wade thought of his own scar, the one along his ribs he never spoke of, souvenir of a war that had cost him more than the wound itself. A brother of his own, dead at Antietam, and a homestead in Missouri he'd never been able to return to because every board of it held a memory he wasn't strong enough to stand inside. "I had a brother too," he said, surprising himself with how easily the words came, as though her honesty had loosened something in his own chest that had been locked shut for years. "Younger than me. Followed me into the war because he didn't want me going without him. Didn't come home." "You carry that with you also," Senna said. It was not a question. Every day. Some days lighter than others. Wade set the bandage aside, meeting her eyes. "Scars mean it lived," my grandmother used to say. "Wound heals over, leaves a mark, but the mark means the body kept fighting." Didn't understand what she meant till I was a lot older than I wanted to be. Senna's fingers closed around the turtle token, and for a long moment, the kitchen held nothing but lamplight and the particular quiet that comes after two people have told each other something true. "Why did you truly buy me, Wade Calloway?" she asked finally. Not the answer you gave the crowd. The real one. He considered lying again the way he had at the auction, and again found he couldn't. "Because I've spent 6 years on this ranch making sure nobody got close enough to see how much of me the war took. Easier that way. Nobody to disappoint, nobody to lose." He turned the bandage roll over in his hands, not looking at her now. "Then I watched a town decide you weren't worth $2. And something in me couldn't stand it. Couldn't stand watching people decide a person's worth like that and just let it happen. So it was not mercy," Senna said slowly. "It was refusal. Maybe those are closer to the same thing than I used to think." She reached out then, unprompted, and pressed the turtle token into his palm, closing his fingers around it with both her hands. "Keep this, until I ask for it back." "That a trust or a test?" "Both," she said, and for the first time since the auction, something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of her mouth. "Do not disappoint me, Wade Calloway." Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the first cold breath of a storm still building somewhere over the western hills. The kind of weather that made livestock restless and men check their locks twice. Wade knew, without either of them saying it, that the peace of this evening was borrowed time, that Coil would return, that the fort would not simply let the matter drop, that whatever quiet understanding had grown between them in this kitchen would be tested by more than words before the week was through. But he closed his hand around the small carved turtle anyway, feeling its worn edges settle into his palm like it had always belonged there, and understood that some things were worth defending even when, especially when, the cost of defending them was already climbing toward more than $2. "There's a storm coming," Senna said, watching the lamp flame bend in a draft that hadn't been there minutes before. "There's always a storm coming," Wade said. "Questions what a man does while it's still building." She held his gaze, steady now in a way she hadn't been since the auction block, and did not look away. "Then we should not waste the time we have arguing about whether it will." The storm broke 2 nights later, and Coil came with it. He arrived not with 2 hired men this time, but with 6, and a wagon behind them meant for hauling something. Someone back to the fort, and a paper he waved like a shield the moment Wade stepped onto the porch with his rifle already in hand. Territorial writ. Coil called through rain that had already soaked his coat black. "Signed by a judge who doesn't care about your $2, Calloway. She comes with us tonight, or you answer for obstruction of federal business." Wade felt Senna come to stand beside him in the doorway, her jaw set the way it had been at the auction block, refusing to let fear be the last thing anyone saw on her face. "Let me see the writ," Wade said. "You'll see it in the wagon. Then we've got nothing to discuss." Coil's patience, thin to begin with, snapped entirely. He raised a hand, and the 6 riders began to fan out around the house in the practiced formation of men who'd done this before, to other homes, other families, and never once had to answer for what it cost the people inside. What happened next, Wade would piece together only afterward in fragments, the way a man remembers a fight rather than watches it. The crack of his rifle taking the first rider's horse out from under him without harming the animal or the man. Senna's voice, sudden and sharp, calling out in a language Wade didn't understand but recognized instantly as command, not plea, and then, astonishingly, riders emerging from the treeline behind Coil's men. A dozen of them, Apache and mixed blood ranch. Hands both, men Senna had quietly sent word to 3 days before, when she'd first understood the storm gathering wasn't only weather. Coil's confidence collapsed the way confidence always collapses when the numbers change. "This is federal land business. This is my land," Wade said, stepping down into the rain, rifle steady, "and that woman standing behind me is not federal property. She's not property at all. You want to test that in front of a dozen witnesses who'll tell it exactly how it happened, you're welcome to try." One of the riders who'd come from the treeline moved his horse forward into the lamplight spilling from the doorway, and Senna made a sound Wade had never heard from her before. Something between a gasp and a sob, raw and immediate, all her careful composure breaking at once. "Tejan," she said, and the name carried a whole history in it. Her brother swung down from his horse before it had fully stopped, and the 2 of them met in the mud and rain with an embrace that needed no translation, that told Wade everything about what 6 months of not knowing had cost her, and what this single moment gave back. Coil, watching his authority evaporate along with his numerical advantage, made the only choice left to a man who valued his own skin above his orders. He lowered his hand, and his remaining riders lowered their weapons with him. "This isn't over," he said, the same words he'd used before, except this time even he seemed to hear how hollow they sounded. "It is for tonight," Wade said. "You want to file your paper with a judge who'll actually hear both sides, you're welcome to. But you ride off my land now, and you don't come back without something better than a writ signed by a man who's never met the woman he's writing it about." Coil rode. His men followed. The rain swallowed the sound of their retreat within minutes, and the yard that had held so much fear only moments before filled instead with the low, relieved murmur of reunion. Senna's people, dismounting, embracing her one by one, Tejan holding his sister's face in both hands as though needing to confirm with his own eyes that she was real. Later, once the rain had eased to a whisper and the fire in the kitchen hearth had dried most of the mud from the floor, Senna found Wade on the porch, watching the last of her people settle for the night in the barn, in the yard, in whatever shelter the ranch could offer. Tejan says there is a valley 2 days south, she said. Land the government has not yet decided to want. My people are gathering there, those who escaped the fort, those who never went. He asks if I will come. Wade felt something in his chest go very still, the particular stillness of a man bracing for a loss he'd known. Somewhere was always the likely ending. Reckon that's your decision. It is, she agreed. She held out her hand, and in her palm sat the carved turtle token, the one she'd given him 3 nights before. I am not asking for this back to leave, Wade Calloway. I am asking because I want you to see something. She turned it over, and in the lamplight spilling from the window, Wade saw what he'd missed before. A second, smaller mark scratched into the underside of the shell, fresh, made recently, made deliberately. 2 letters, carved crude but clear. W and S. I carved it 3 nights ago, she said, while you slept. I did not know yet if I would have the courage to show you. And now I have a valley 2 days south, and a brother who needs me, and a people who are rebuilding something the world tried to take from them. She closed his fingers around the token once more, the same gesture as before, but different now, weighted with everything the intervening days had cost and given them both. And I have a ranch 2 hours from a town that once thought I was worth $2, and a man who thought I was worth defending with his life. I do not think home has to be only one thing, Wade Calloway. My mother believed we carry it with us. Perhaps we can carry it between 2 places, if both are willing to hold it. Wade understood, then, what she was truly asking. Not a choice between her people and him, but a partnership neither auction block nor federal writ had ever accounted for. A life built across distance and difference and the hard-won trust of 2 people who had each, in their own way, stopped being willing to disappear quietly into what the world expected of them. Valley 2 days south, he said slowly. Barn roof still leaks up here. Then perhaps you will need to learn to fix roofs in 2 places, Senna said, and this time, finally, she smiled. Not the careful, guarded almost smile from before, but something open and unguarded and entirely hers. Reckon I could learn that, Wade said. Years later, travelers passing through the valley south of Larkspur would hear the story from ranchers and elders alike, of the cowboy who paid $2 at an auction and got, in return, more courage and more family than money could ever measure. They would see, if they looked closely enough at the beam over the door of a modest ranch house that stood between 2 worlds, 2 names carved deep into the old wood, Wade and Senna. Beneath them, smaller, nearly worn away by years of hands touching it in passing. A turtle, carrying its home wherever it needed to go. The town never did collect on Coyle's writ. Some debts, it turned out, Mercy had already paid in full.